tours for the past 3 decades, showing tourists the mammals and other wildlife of diverse lands from Sri Lanka to Alaska and Argentina. In addition to mammals, Fiona studies moths and nocturnal pollinators. Her backyard is a 26-acre patch of hardwood forest, ponds, and swamp on the Niagara Escarpment near Milton, Ontario. So I'm pleased to introduce Fiona. And Fiona, it'll be nice to actually see you instead of just communicating by email.
Okay, hello. Can everyone hear me? Yep, okay. Thank you very much, Linda. I just want to say 2 things. First of all, I'm technologically challenged, so bear with me if I'm a bit slow at getting set up. And I live in the country and my Wi-Fi is not particularly reliable either. So if I suddenly stop and everything slows down, somebody let me know that you can't hear me anymore, because it's hard to tell from my end. I can still hear myself speaking. Hopefully it'll be all right, but I live on the escarpment, and for a long time, I think the only places with Wi-Fi this bad were the Atacama Desert and this part of the escarpment. So it's surprising being an hour from Toronto to have such lousy reception, but there you go. But it does usually work, so fingers crossed it'll be all right. Yes, thank you very much for inviting me. I will be talking a lot about some of the subjects you have coming up, actually, native plants and pollinator gardens and milkweed as well, because all relate to my talk. Yeah, I am really more of a mammalogist, but I like the animals that are sort of much maligned, like bats. I like furry, nocturnal, maligned creatures. In other words, bats and moths. They're very they have more in common than you think. And I guess my talk is pre for COVID, because we're all stuck at home. So don't just go look around your in the daytime, go out and see what's going on at night. And so that's what I'm going to do. And now, if all goes well, I will share my screen. It's going to take a little bit because I've got a weird system here, but let's see if this works. Oh, it doesn't say which one. Oh, let's just go here. I think this will work. Okay. There we go. Okay. Can everyone see that?
Yep, that looks good, Fiona.
All right. Phew. Okay. So I'm going to take you around my garden and learn about some of the critters, mostly small, that you can see in your garden. I am lucky that I live in the forest, so I have a lot of land around that's natural, and that increases the number of small and medium and large animals that come to visit. My front yard is mostly natives, and people were talking about bee balm. You can see a little bit of bee balm there on the left, which is actually now taken over most of the front garden. I planted a lot of plants for butterflies, and then because I'm surrounded by trees, I don't really have that much sun, and I wasn't getting that many butterflies, but I found I was getting numerous moths. And now my garden criteria is it has to provide food for some insect or other, and more natives and less non-natives, but I do still have a few non-native plants. Some of the wildlife that you can find in the garden at night include various predators, spiders, frogs, ambush bugs. You also, a lot of people study the non-feeding adult insects by putting up lights or turning on your porch lights and seeing what moths and other insects will come to the lights. I think that's our sort of diurnal view of things, that everything has to be light oriented, but there are quite a few insects that are attracted to lights, and you can learn about them just by turning on your porch light, or better yet, using a UV light. Then I actually like tramping around and seeing what things are actually doing. And certainly you can find nectar in the summer, not just your daytime gaudy day flyers like butterflies and hummingbirds, but also some more interesting and obscure moths and other pollinators on the flowers. And then, of course, we have various herbivores, some of which we really wish we didn't have, like gypsy moth caterpillars, but some very respectable caterpillars too, and beetles and other insects that are chomping away in the garden. So we're going to sort of look at these different groups. The predators in the garden are include frogs and toads, assassin bugs, bats and owls, but I'm not really going to go into them. I am lucky that I have both of those around here, and I have a bat box too, but this is more about the little critters. Ambush bugs, spiders, lacewings, mantids, and salamanders all frequent my flowering plants at night. Some of the frogs that I have, the gray tree frog, which sometimes is green and sometimes much grayer, always really spectacular beasts though. They will be calling right now. If you have a vernal pond nearby, this is a great time to go out on a warm night. It's actually very cold here. I don't know what it's like for you, but it's quite cold here at the moment. But on a warmer night, this is the time of year for the gray tree frogs to be singing away, and they like branches that overhang water. So I don't have them. I have them on my deck, but they don't really come and forage in the garden per se. They tend to hunt up in the canopy more, I think. The wood frogs, on the other hand, stay in the forest or in deep vegetation. They don't climb very much, and I see them sort of more in the grass. I don't really see them hunting at night in the garden. Toads really like to hunt on the ground, and they often come if you turn on your porch light. The toads will come in the hopes that some of the moths and other insects will drop to the ground where they can grab them. But the major amphibian predator in my garden is the spring peeper. Hearing them probably for the last month or so, calling away from the ponds. It's a really nice sign of spring coming. Even on a quite cold day or evening, you'll hear them peeping away. But in the summer, I discovered that they really like to hunt in my flower bed. I guess you'd have to be not too far from a pond or a marsh situation, but they do wander quite widely through the woods. So they'll be up in the trees during the day, like this one, and then at night they come down into the flowers. I never see them during the day, but at night they're hunting from all the flowering plants that are providing a good source of pollen or nectar, because they like to feed on the moths that visit those flowers. So they'll be on the goldenrods and the sedum and the coneflowers. And I've always really wanted to catch one getting a moth. I've got a picture of one or two with a bit of moth sticking out of its mouth, but I've never actually managed to get a photo of them catching the moths. But that's obviously what they're there for. I see red-backed salamanders on warm nights strolling around in the vegetation. They're actually very good climbers. You know, you get so used to just seeing these critters underneath logs, or, you know, in the daytime where they're hanging out, you think they're very terrestrial because you'll be turning over logs or looking under boards and find them there. But at night, they can climb quite high in the vegetation in search of food, although they like to eat things like earthworms and stuff that are low down as well. We find that they're very active around some of the ponds in October as well. I don't know why particularly then, but you can sometimes see 50 or 100 out foraging at night in the later part of the summer. If you look closely, you'll see this moth's a little bit worried, but that's because at the bottom of the page there's an ambush bug. Ambush bugs are hemipterans that are very good predators of moths and other flying insects. And you can see the sort of very powerful forelimbs. Can you see my arrow if I do that? Do you see the arrow? I don't know if you can see the arrow. But anyway, ambush bugs close up, they managed to catch quite large moths. So that moth had every reason to be worried. Trying very hard to get a picture of this. It's pink-patched looper, a very elegant moth, but they're very fast. They're always hovering. They're just really, really difficult to photograph. And I finally got one staying still on this purple coneflower. I took a whole bunch of pictures. Then I noticed there was something yellow by its head, and I was kind of wondering what was going on. And I realized the reason it was still was because it was being consumed by the ambush bug. So that was a bit sad. But you can see, if you look closely at the ambush bug's legs, you can see they're covered in pollen. So here's a predator that will also act as a pollinator and will move from plant to plant. So it's an important garden beastie. Spiders are probably the major predator in the garden. The flower crab spider is always to be found on flowers. Sometimes in the daytime, they can be really quite inconspicuous, and you get yellow ones on the goldenrod and white ones. This is on Lysimachia. But they're extremely adept hunters, and they also are using the flowers to attract their prey and hanging out and waiting for them. Here's another moth I really wanted to see well, and then I find it that has been grabbed by a spider. This is a lettered sphinx, and it had come to some chokecherry at the end of my driveway, and was caught by this crab spider and then rolled up and consumed later. You can see the tongue of the moth there. Whoops, just go back. How do I go back? Okay, so there are, yes, here are a couple more spiders catching prey, one on Jacob's ladder and another one on alternate leaf dogwood, the rather sad looking white slant line that's being caught by a non-native spider that's quite a common garden occupant. The praying mantids are another very attractive looking beast that you can sometimes find in the garden. I think all of our mantids are non-native, but they're still quite elegant. And this one was rather nice. It's covered in dew. Here you can see one in action. It's quite interesting. The predator is below. You can see him, and the color matches really well with the underside of the leaves here. This is a moonflower, so the nocturnal equivalent of a morning glory, and a beautiful sphinx moth feeding, and the predator is like hanging out in wait below. So they too can capture prey that's quite a bit larger than they are. Lacewings are lovely looking insects, and this one's on just a weed in the garden of Viper's bugloss, although it's a weed I happen to really admire. And these are important predators of aphids, so it's nice to have them in the garden to control the aphids. Moving on to another group of critters in the garden, the herbivores. Beetles eat a lot of leaf material, the June beetles especially, katydids, grasshoppers, sawfly bugs are similar looking to caterpillars but have legs. Obviously slugs and snails are major herbivores, and earwigs, and we'll talk more about caterpillars a bit later. So here are a couple of broad-nosed weevils making more broad-nosed weasels, and these are introduced species, and it's often the introduced species that do the most damage both to the garden and the forest. So the slugs and snails and earwigs and other beetles, the aliens, Japanese beetles are a case in point as well. They'll be eating, and they don't have as many predators perhaps as some of our native species, so things can get a bit out of whack. That's definitely true with the gypsy moth caterpillars, which are just going to be emerging now. I don't know about you, but we all had a very bad year for gypsy moths in this area last year, and it's probably looks like it might be bad this year. The katydids are native and they're much more balanced, really elegant looking critters. I was lucky enough to see this katydid emerging from its shedding skin. This really looks sort of to me like a ballerina. Anyway, very nice animals to have wandering around in your garden. Grasshoppers will feed on a variety of different plant material. Different species use different plants. Leafhoppers, these are really pretty, very tiny creatures, maybe 1 centimeter long or less. And you can get the green ones or the pink ones, the same species, I believe. And they both have bright red eyes. And they suck on the juices of plants. So they're not going to be consuming whole leaves, but they'll probably be sucking on the stems. Stink bugs, some stink bugs are predatory, some are omnivorous, and some, like this one, are herbivorous. So this is a green stink bug. It's very easy to find stink bugs in the garden and in the forest, at night especially. And now moving on to moths, the unappreciated, overlooked pollinators. Moths are really diverse and colorful, and it's a shame really that people, when they think of moths, think about carpet moths or clothes moths, a couple of small species that are European, they're not even native to Canada, whereas our moths primarily are beneficial as adults, and most are not harmful as caterpillars. Because they're nocturnal, they're really not that well known. So it's easy to learn new things. I think that's why moths are particularly interesting to me. So you can find out more about moths by setting out bait. Moth bait is a mix of smushy, very ripe banana, some beer, brown sugar, ripe peaches if you want, sort of a sugary, alcoholic, fruity mixture. And you can paint this on trees and walk around later looking for them. Moths, very early in the year, a lot of moths feed on sap when there are no flowers. And so sap and this bait mixture form a similar sort of role. Later in the summer, moth bait is excellent if you want to see species like underwing moths, which is the one that's in the lower middle, well, top row middle below the text here. We have really nice diversity of underwing moths in Ontario. So many you can find, and they're just really fantastic. There's a one over here, the white underwing with the black underparts on the lower left too. So you can also, it says, or plant a moth. It doesn't mean plant a moth. It's supposed to say plant a moth garden. I'm not sure what happened to that last word, but I have a moth garden. So that's my way of learning more about moths, is to actually follow them around the flowers in the garden. This is a moth that sort of got me started on being fascinated with moths and pollination and nectar feeding in general. It's a hologram moth, and they have these very bright, shiny green patches on the wings, but when you see them flying around the garden, they look like they have black patches on the wings. And I didn't know what this big moth was that had big black patches on its wings. So I chased it around until eventually it stopped long enough to feed that I could take pictures, and then discovered that the black was just this iridescent that can look bright green. It's feeding on Nicotiana, which is the white Nicotiana that opens at night and smells really great. So it's one of my favorite night flowers, although I have to admit it's not native. I haven't grown it for a few years. And if you look the stem of the flower goes off the page, and the moth's tongue is extending off the page that you're seeing here. So they have this incredibly long tongue to reach down for nectar. So this is how I started chasing moths around my garden. And I contend that moths are very important pollinators, and I'm going to provide you with some of the evidence for that. For one thing, there are about 15 times as many moths as butterflies in the USA. And even here in Ontario, I think we have about 3,000 species of moths. There are about 3 times as many moth species as bee species. So there's a huge amount of diversity and shapes and sizes to fit different flowers. And if you look closely at this moth, you can see its tongue is covered in pollen. There's grains of pollen on the antennae and on the legs. And on this one, it's even got pollen on its eyes and lots of pollen on the wings. The soft scales of moths are very good at trapping pollen grains and transferring them from one flower to another. Not all moths feed on nectar. Some moths don't feed as adults, they only feed as caterpillars. So I'm just going to run through some of the different types of moths that you can find in your garden or in a garden. Plume moths are these T-shaped moths that look a bit like a helicopter when they're flying around. So that family, they're always in the garden. Grass phonemes and pyrostenes and the crambids, almost all the crambids feed. I think they all do actually. And they come to a variety of flowers. They're usually smallish moths. The geometers or the inchworm caterpillars and the geometer moths, they often emerge early. A lot of them come and they'll feed on our flowering trees. If you think about it, most of the early flowering trees have white flowers, the cherries, hawthorns, dogwoods, and I think white is helpful to attract these particular moths to feed on them. Well, for any nocturnal species to find them. Some sphinx moths don't feed as adults, the lunar moth, but others do. So especially the hummingbird clearwings, they're ones that you can see flying around by day as well as at night. So some of them do and some of them don't, not the whole family. The same is true of the litter moths, owlets, and underwings. Some of them feed at night and some of them don't feed at all as adults, only as in the caterpillar stage. Most of the loopers and sallows and pinions and darts feed. And again, you can see a lot of pollen on this guy's tongue. This is a white speck on a honesty. So those are the moths that come to flowers in the garden. I'm just going to show you a few pictures to show you how attractive they are, at least to me. This is a leaf roller. It's a kind of crambid feeding on buddleia. And a pinion feeding on autumn joy sedum, a sedum that flowers quite late, so it's not native. It does provide some nectar for the late feeding insects. Blue sage, I used to be very fond of this, now less so because I'm more native oriented, but it does provide food. It's sort of at a time when the early native flowers have finished and the summer flowers haven't really started, so it can be helpful. The moth on the right side, the small magpie, is a non-native moth as well. It's a European species. Quite pretty though. And the white slant line is one that's quite common in my area. And cosmos, again, is sort of an annual that's helpful to fill gaps when you're waiting for some perennials to get big, and it's attractive to lots of insects. on Cosmos. But getting more and more into nature and the various interrelationships, I'm definitely veering to having more and more native plants in my garden and learning more about the interactions between the native plants and the native insects. And so this is a list of some of the best native plants for nighttime and daytime, actually. We don't really have any plants that I know of that are local, that are specific for only provide nectar at night. Although there are some plants that seem to be pollinated specifically by moths. Some of the blueberries and other heaths and those kinds of flowers have been shown to not really set much fruit if they're covered over at night. So they seem to be favored by moths as pollinators. So we're going to go through most of these groups of flowers and have a quick look at some of them with their visitors of various kinds. Native plants I think are really nice and look great in the garden. Here's some Monarda and some Rudbeckia. Mountain mint is a fantastic plant to have in a garden for if you want to see insects, always covered with bees and wasps and other small flying insects by day, and very useful for moths at night. This is a raspberry pyrosta. And also, if you look closely at the mountain mint, it has these cute little purple dots on the flowers. You don't really see it when you're just looking at the whole plant because the flowers are quite small. It also gets visited by these plume moths that come in like a helicopter landing. The bee balms, both the wild bergamot and scarlet bee balms, are very useful garden plants, native plants for a variety of different insects. The monarda is visited by the hummingbird clearwings by day, which is really nice, as well as numerous other moths at night. This is a sort of cultivar of bee balm, so it's a rather odd color. It's not scarlet and it's not pink. It's a sort of deep color, but it's very popular with big moths. This is a beautiful goldenrod hooded owlet feeding on the bee balm. Here are three very nice native plants to have in your garden because they look beautiful. They behave quite nicely and they're very, very attractive to insects. So there's the wild bergamot top left, and then downy woodmint. It's only actually native, I think, to Peely Island, but that's Ontario. So I guess that unless you're a real purist, that's fine. It's a lovely plant. And the blazing star liatris is all very good for a lot of different insect visitors. Another great family of plants are the Eupatorium, and like these bone sets and snakeroot and Joe Pyeweed. They're all great for insects and they look nice too. And meadowsweet, narrowleaf meadowsweet, the native spirea is a great plant, a shrub to have in the garden and replace the Japanese spirea, but I'll be talking more about that in a little bit. So just to show you, this is a grass veneer, is a moth that's only about less than an inch long, but it's very pretty because it's sort of gold and white. Sometimes you get tiny moths on big flowers. I guess the tongue is long enough to fit down there. So the Rudbeckias, this green-headed coneflower, being visited by a little tiny double-striped scoparia. And then you get some big moths on big flowers too. This is one of the beautiful underwing moths, a wonderful underwing, in fact. And notice there's a caterpillar in the picture as well. So the coneflower is serving a double role here for nectar and for herbivory. Ironweed is a great flower to have. It's pretty tall, but the flowers are beautiful color and they attract all kinds of insects too. So here's a maple spanworm, which is a type of geometer feeding on ironweed. And here are some of the early spring geometers feeding on black cherry. Many-lined carpet, I think, is a very, very pretty little moth. And the scallop mataranthus, both feeding on the trees, the big black cherry trees. I had to get up a ladder to get the picture of the lower one because it was quite high. Goldenrod is just a fantastic plant. I know it's annoying in the garden. Sometimes if it takes over, it can really take over and you have to sort of limit it. But if you have any unused corners, it's a wonderful plant to put in because it provides food for so many different insects and it's always buzzing with life, and both for predators and herbivores and pollinators. And of course, milkweed. Milkweed's really the star of the show. Swamp milkweed is just a fantastic flower. Those are the two on the left is swamp milkweed. And I've recorded at least 40 different moth species in my garden, visiting different milkweeds. I have 3 species of milkweed in the garden. Common milkweed tends to grow by spread with underground runners, and so it can really take over. So if you want to have that, you could put it in a planter, and then that also limits its growth. And monarch caterpillars actually prefer the the smaller, younger leaves of milkweed. So stopping it getting really tall it can be helpful to them too. So a few things I've discovered by wandering around my garden at night, apart from the fact that it's a really good way to annoy my daughter with the flashes by her window. She's telling me I'm too much strobe light going on. That moths are really incredible, fascinating creatures. And there's always something else in the picture when you look at it later. So as I have already said, moths are really underrated as pollinators. Too much credit to the bees. I mean, bees are great, and here this on goldenrod completely covered in pollen. The antennae are just carrying so much pollen. It's also on the legs and the chest and the back. Sometimes moths are a bit sticky though. This one is stealing nectar. So instead of inserting its head and being daubed with pollen on its from the front of the flower, it's slipping in between 2 of the petals and getting nectar that way. Bees do this too sometimes. They cheat and steal nectar. Moths don't only feed on nectar. I've also seen them feeding on decomposing petals. And in many cases, tiger moths, especially like the one on the lower right, they pick up chemicals in these decomposing petals that are toxic, and they can use these in nuptial rituals where they pass toxins to their mate, and they can get the toxins maybe in the eggs and the caterpillars then, and it's a way of protecting the caterpillars from being predated. I have no idea why the moth was feeding on a dry seed pod. I mean, there was liquid in some of those bits of seed pod, but I don't know what benefit that bestowed on the moth. I've also found numerous moths, actually about 30 different species, feeding on the leaf surface of raspberries, both the wild raspberries, the purple flowering raspberry, and some of my garden edible raspberries. But they really like whatever it is on the surface. So there must be some interesting chemical on raspberries. I guess raspberry leaves are sometimes used for tea. It might be worth trying. Some things that look like moths aren't moths. So caddisflies sometimes feed on flowers as well. This is a caddisfly. You get a lot of them coming to lights as well. especially if you live like near a pond, I do. Crane flies will come and feed on nectar secreted from the aphids that are sucking the plant juices. This was a bit surprising to me. So of course, looking at moths a lot, I see a lot of caterpillars as well. And as you know, moths go through 4 stages in their life history, from egg to caterpillar to pupa to adult. These are not all the same species, but so I became more and more interested in the early stages, caterpillars in particular. This is how moths reproduce. They usually go into this sort of back-to-back position, but sometimes face-to-face. These are probably our most amazing looking large moths. We have a few here. I don't know what your populations of lunar moths are like in your area, but in our area, they're really quite scarce, but I have found some on my property, and here they are mating. This is just I had a moth that landed on my boot, and I thought, what's wrong with this moth? It has such tiny little wings, but it had just emerged. And so I took some pictures of it developing the wings. The wings were puffing up, and the blood getting into the wings and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually there you can see the contrast between the top left, where the wings are so tiny, and then when they're fully extended after emerging from the cocoon. So, but caterpillars are really the key to everything. And sometimes they're also quite dramatic, like this crown slug moth is rather a plain looking moth that has a really incredible looking caterpillar. And these caterpillars feed on most of our large native trees like elms, hickories, maples. Here's another slug moth. The adult slug moths don't feed at all, but this caterpillar and the adult both very attractive. And the caterpillar feeds on oak, maple, and beech. So again, it feeds on a lot of leaves of a lot of native trees. And here are some other beautiful caterpillars from my garden. The goldenrod hooded owlet on the left, striped with yellow and black and red. Always found on goldenrod, just feeds on goldenrod. The red spotted purple on cherry. The milkweed tussock moth on milkweed, and the snowberry clearing on snowberry. So the caterpillars are always looking for specific host plants, and 99% of the time, those are native species. So we need those native plants in order to provide for food for the caterpillars. Just a few more caterpillars, the forest tent caterpillars. You see them on cherry and you think, oh, they're going to destroy the whole tree, but the trees tend to recover quite quickly, even though they may get fed on by a large number of tent caterpillars. I wanted to show this Abbot Sphinx, which has this amazing eye. The top right here looks like a snake eye, and it feeds on grape, Virginia creeper and grape. And when it's rolled up, it can look a bit like a bunch of grapes because of its amazing pattern. Hickory tussock moths on the bottom feed on hickory and ash and elm. So when you think about feeding birds, I think most people think about birds being fed in winter. We always feel sorry for birds because it's out there in cold conditions. So you think of bird food as seed, or, for the snow buntings throwing out grain, having a chickadee come to your finger. That's what a lot of people think of when they think of feeding birds, or maybe a few berries for the fall. But this is really what summer bird food looks like. Caterpillars. Baby birds are incredibly dependent on caterpillars. So here you can see most of our songbirds will be gathering caterpillars to feed their young. They'll be starting that very soon. Chickadees, a pair of chickadees feed 400 to 500 caterpillars a day to their young. And the nestlings will eat up to 9,000 caterpillars before they fledge. And that's just one brood of one pair of chickadees. So having a lot of caterpillars around is really important for our birds. Just can't make it unless they have caterpillars. And you need to have a really diversity, because something could happen. One caterpillar might not make it, one species. And so we need to have all those native plants and all those different species of caterpillars. So just to have a comparison, I put this together to compare, like, these are all members of the rose family. And on the left, we have a native rose and a non-native rose, a native spirea and a non-native spirea, and then two miscellaneous natives, a native ninebark, although that's a cultivar because the leaves are a weird color, but ninebark versus Cotoneaster. And I looked up how many different species of caterpillars are supported by these plants. So that you can see they're sort of paired up. And using HOST, which is a database of all the world's Lepidoptera. On the left, you can see the two rose species. The natives are the blue, and the non-native are the red bars. So the native rose can provide about 17 different species of caterpillars, whereas the non-native, I think it's one. Spirea, which is a shrub, provides leaves for over about 47 different species of caterpillar. And the pink spirea, which you see growing all over towns and all over the place, and it's actually quite invasive, doesn't support any caterpillars. Native ninebark supports about 38 species of caterpillar, whereas Cotoneaster from Asia, I believe, only will host one caterpillar in our area. Trees, it's even more dramatic. All the moths and butterflies need leaves for caterpillars, and even though they may be eating your leaves normally, by fall, even your trees still look pretty well stocked with leaves. This is my driveway. But how important are they, the native versus non-natives? If we look at red maple versus Norway maple, you can see that red maple can host over 100 different species of caterpillars, whereas Norway maple hosts about 4 or 5. Birch is really a superstar. There's various birches across Canada can host over 400 different species of caterpillars. And ginkgo is 1 or 2. Red oak, oaks in general, all the oak species combined host more caterpillars than any other tree, but just red oak on its own hosts about 175 species. And buckthorn, the horrible invasive tree that we have, hosts only about 1. And people flock to Toronto to see Japanese cherry. They're very pretty trees for sure, but they don't provide food for birds at all. Maybe one species of caterpillar on a Japanese cherry, whereas black cherry can host about 200 different species of caterpillar. So the natives really win when it comes to providing food for caterpillars, and thus providing food for birds and moths and butterflies, everything. All the complex relationships that are going on in our gardens. So what can you do to help the wildlife in your garden? Well, plant native plants, especially the trees and shrubs. Add a pond, that's always a really nice thing to have in the garden, and lots of animals will come to it. Don't spray, and you have every reason to be a bit messy. Don't rake up the leaves, leave places for insects to hide away, leave some dead branches, and don't be too tidy. And I really think it's time we all started to reduce our lawns, and I'm glad to hear you're having a talk about monarchs and ditches, because less lawn, more monarchs. It'd be a great thing, and it will also affect so many other species at the same time if we have a greater diversity in our lands. And I think so. It's my goal is plant more native plants for moths, birds, and all the other critters that are there, and increase local biodiversity, and hopefully overall global biodiversity. And so thank you very much for listening to my talk. I'd be happy to answer any questions. I got to figure out how to get out of this. I'll stop sharing my screen. Oh, this is a mayapple flower, by the way, which will be flowering very soon. Not flowering here yet, but should be flowering soon. Okay, so go back to this screen. Anyone have a question?
Thank you, thank you, thank you. That was wonderful. And so badly needed. It's such an important talk. And,
thank you.
And so timely. There's so many people now that are paying attention, I think, to nature. And so now is a good time for this kind of message. Can I ask you one quick question?
Yes.
When I went through my moth phase many years ago, was it my imagination, or do moths fly better when it's humid, slightly wet out?
Yes, they do. They seem to love it. If you've had a rain in the office, they don't like it when it's really windy and big. They like it to be dark and damp, and yeah, even rainy. It can be, you know, light rain, not a really heavy rain. But yes, they love humid conditions. I don't know why, but they do. Yeah.
Oh, can I ask a question? When you say they're non-native